Hi, welcome back. In episode 1, we stepped back and asked a bigger question. What does sustainability actually mean when the world is volatile, institutions are strained, and systems are under pressure? We touched on the work of Pratima Bansal, who reminds us that sustainability is not just about isolated corporate gestures, but about the long-term resilience of the systems that support life, markets, and society. We also drew on Nassim Nicholas Taleb's idea of the anti-fragile, a term that means something more than resilient. A resilient system survives stress and returns to where it was. An anti-fragile system, through volatility, learns through disruption and adapts rather than merely ascribing shocks. And we revisited the old but increasingly urgent warning of the World Commission on Environment and Development, or the WCED, which cautioned decades ago that environmental decline, economic instability, and social inequality cannot be solved in fragments. They require cooperation across borders, sectors, and institutions. In other words, sustainability was never meant to be a silo. It was always meant to be systemic, relational, and multilateral. And that brings us directly to today's episode, because one of the most influential ways sustainability is now interpreted in the real world is through ratings, rankings, and scores. These numbers influence how investors judge, how procurement teams select suppliers, how boards talk about risk, and how the public forms quick impressions of whether a company is responsible, irresponsible, leading, or lagging. But here's the problem. Many people look at a sustainability rating as though it were a final verdict. They assume it tells us in one clean number whether a company is good or bad. It does not. A sustainability rating is not a moral truth. It is not divine revelation. It is not even a universal definition of performance. It is a model. And by model, I mean a structured method for organizing selected data, assigning weight to certain factors, and producing an interpretation. The moment we understand that something important becomes clear, when ratings disagree, it does not automatically mean one is fraudulent and the other is correct. Very often it means they are answering different questions. So, tonight, I want to slow the whole subject down and make it readable. I want to define the key terms clearly, explain why ratings diverge, and deal honestly with some of the thorniest issues in this space. What happens when a company's score is affected by sanctions, penalties, or fatalities, including events shaped by actors or conditions outside the firm's direct control? Because if we do not think carefully here, we risk confusing risk exposure with moral guilt. And that is where sloppy analysis begins. Let's start with the term sustainability rating itself. A sustainability rating is a score or assessment that evaluates a company using environmental, social, and governance information. You will often hear the shorthand ESG, which stands for environmental, social, and environmental refers to how a company interacts with the natural world. Things like emissions, waste, energy, water, pollution, or climate strategy. Social refers to how it treats people, its workers, the communities in which it operates, contractors, customers, and others affected by its operations. Governance refers to how it is directed and controlled, the board oversight, ethics, executive incentives, compliance systems, ownership structures, and internal accountability. That sounds straightforward, but the real complexity begins with this question. What exactly is being measured? Is the rating trying to assess how much harm Is it trying to estimate how much ESG related risk could affect the company financially? Is it evaluating management systems and disclosure quality? Is it measuring whether the company's products and businesses modeled are aligned with the transition to a low carbon or more sustainable economy? Those are not the same thing. Some ratings are best understood as risk ratings. A risk rating is trying to estimate how exposed a company is to material ESG risks after accounting for its management systems. The word material here is important. In this context, it means significant enough to influence financial performance, decision-making, or enterprise value. So, when a rating agency says it focuses on financially material issues, it means it is asking which ESG issues are more important to matter to investors, lenders, insurers, or the company's long-term financial position. A risk rating is asking how exposed is this company to significant environmental, social, or governance risks that could affect its business. Other ratings are more performance-oriented. These compare a company to its peers and how well it is managing the issues considered most important in its industry. This is why you will sometimes see a company ranked highly in one system and poorly in another. One methodology may be rewarding strong disclosure and management practices relative to competitors. Another may be judging whether the business model itself is fundamentally aligned with sustainability goals. These are very important and different lenses. Then there are ratings that focus heavily on management systems, especially across the supply chain. A supply chain is the network of firms, workers, facilities, transport systems, and sourcing relationships involved in bringing a product to market. For many corporations, a large share of labor risk, environmental harm, and reputational vulnerability sits not at headquarters, but deep inside the supply chain. So ratings place major emphasis on policies, audits, certifications, supplier codes of conduct, grievance mechanisms, and evidence of implementation. While in other models, the question becomes, does this company actually appear to have a credible system for managing ESG issues, especially beyond its own walls? And increasingly, there's another lens, core business alignment. This asks not just whether a company has policies, committees, targets, and reporting, but whether what it actually sells, builds, finances, or deploys is compatible with a more sustainable future. Does the company generate revenue from goods and services that support decarbonization or social need? Is its capital expenditure, often called CapEx, meaning money spent on long-term assets and infrastructure, being directed to transition activities? Is its R&D or research and development moving towards solutions rather than just optimizing the old models? This matters because the company can have polished policies and still be making most of its money from activities that remain fundamentally misaligned with sustainability goals. So, the first discipline in reading any rating is to stop staring at the number and start asking a better question. What kind of model is this? What is it really trying to tell me? That alone helps explain why ratings diverge, and divergence is one of the defining features of this field. The same company in the same year can look like a leader under one system and a laggard under another. Why? Because methodologies differ in purpose, scope, weightings, data sources, and treatment of controversies. Some models rely heavily on public disclosures. Others incorporate company-submitted evidence. Some emphasize governance because governance can be measured more clearly. Others emphasize business model exposure. Some penalize controversies sharply and immediately. Others interpret incidents as one signal among many. Some compare companies only to their industry peers. Others evaluate them against broader transition criteria. This is why sustainability ratings should be treated as analytical instruments and not as absolute truth. Think of them like different kinds of lenses: a microscope, a telescope, an X-ray machine. They all reveal something real, but not the same thing. The error is not in using lenses. The error is in forgetting which lens you are looking through. And now we come to the important global shift. More and more, sustainability analysis is moving away from broad storytelling and toward measurable transition indicators. The conversation is becoming more quantitative. Analysts increasingly ask how much of a company's revenue comes from activities considered sustainable. How much of its investment is going into transition-related assets? How quickly the direction and capital is changing, and whether the company is repositioning its core business for a world shaped by climate risk, regulatory change, geopolitical instability, and social pressure. That does not mean narrative no longer matters. It means narrative is increasingly being tested against numbers. This shift matters because it reduces the power of vague corporate language. A firm can say it supports the transition, but if its capital allocation tells another story, ratings that focus on core business alignment may not be impressed. At the same time, we need to be careful here too. Some ratings remain peer relative, meaning they compare a company to others in the same sector. Peer relative means performance is judged in comparison with similar firms, not against an absolute planetary threshold or ideal sustainability endpoint. So a firm can be best in class in an industry that is still, in broader terms, nowhere near where it needs to be. But it is a limitation and it must be understood. Now we arrive at the most ethically difficult part of the conversation: penalties, sanctions, and fatalities. Some sustainability methodologies deduct points or assign harsher risk assessments when companies are linked to major fines, regulatory sanctions, safety failures, pollution events, labor abuses, or fatalities. On one level, that makes sense. Accountability matters. Harm matters. Governance failure matters. And a company that repeatedly creates preventable damage should not be insulated from consequences simply because it has a glossy sustainability report. But the analysis becomes more complicated when the triggering event involves third parties, fragile operating environments, or external shocks. A company may operate in a conflict-affected zone, a sanctioned jurisdiction, or a highly unstable security environment. A sanction may arise from geopolitical developments that move quickly and unpredictably. A fatality may occur in conditions shaped not only by corporate decisions, but by violence, sabotage, armed conflict, or terrorist action. That does not automatically erase corporate responsibility, but neither does it justify simplistic interpretation. This is where I think one distinction is absolutely necessary, both ethically and analytically. The distinction between responsibility and exposure. Responsibility concerns what a company can reasonably control. It includes the strength of its safety systems, compliance culture, contractor oversight, due diligence, training, emergency planning, escalation procedures, and whether it ignored foreseeable warning signs. Exposure concerns the environment in which the company operates. It includes geopolitical volatility, conflict intensity, state fragility, supply chain complexity, infrastructure weakness, and the baseline probability that something harmful may happen even when internal controls are relatively strong. If we collapse these two concepts into one, we lose precision. And once we lose precision, we start making poor judgments. A highly controversial signal does not always mean the same thing. Sometimes it indicates deep negligence. Sometimes it indicates severe operating exposure. Sometimes it reflects both. The responsible question is not, was there an incident? Full stop. The better question is, what was the company's duty of care in that context? How well did it meet that duty? The phrase duty of care refers to the obligation to take responsible steps to prevent foreseeable harm. It does not require omnipotence. It requires seriousness, preparation, and responsible conduct appropriate to the context. That means a company operating in a fragile or conflict-exposed environment should not be judged by the same operating assumptions as one working in a highly stable jurisdiction with strong institutions and low security. But it also should not be excused from rigorous expectations simply because the environment is difficult. The whole point is to ask whether the company's systems rose to the level demanded by the context. This matters enormously because we are living in an era in which supply chains are longer, political shocks travel faster, and interdependence is deeper, which takes us right back to the warning from the WCED. When the Commission warned that environmental and developmental crises are interconnected and cannot be solved in isolation, it was also implicitly warning that accountability frameworks must be capable of handling complexity. And complexity means that the line between direct control and systemic entanglement is not always neat. A sustainability rating that ignores systemic exposure becomes shallow. A rating that ignores responsibility becomes permissive. Serious analysis has to hold both. And this, I think, is where the tie-in to Taleb becomes especially useful. Taleb's work reminds us that systems are often judged too confidently in periods of apparent calm. Then a shock arrives, and suddenly what looked efficient reveals itself to have been fragile all along. In sustainability terms, fragility can take many forms. Overextended sourcing, concentrated suppliers, poor safety culture, weak compliance monitoring, thin redundancy, dependence on unstable jurisdictions, or a business model that only works under narrow assumptions. A controversy, in that sense, may not merely be a scandal. It may be a signal that the system was brittle. But we should still be careful. Not every shock proves guilt. Sometimes it reveals vulnerability. Sometimes it reveals negligence. Sometimes it reveals a world in which both the company and the surrounding system were more fragile than they appeared. That is why Pratima Band's perspective still matters here. If sustainability is about the long-term viability of systems, then ratings should not merely reward polished disclosure. They should help us see whether systems, institutions, business models, and relationships are becoming more adaptive, more trustworthy, and less likely to generate cascading harm. That is a much richer question than whether a company has learned to speak fluent ESG. So how should we as viewers, professionals, citizens, investors, or policymakers actually read these ratings more intelligently? Well, we should begin by asking what is being measured. Is the model focused on risk, management, quality, peer performance, or business model alignment? We should ask whether the score is pure relative or closer to an absolute threshold. We should ask what data sources are used and whether the model depends heavily on self-disclosure. We should ask how controversies are treated, whether the methodology distinguishes between preventable failures and external shocks, and how much weight it gives to the supply chain, contractors, subsidiaries, or joint ventures. We should ask whether the model is rewarding transparency, punishing opacity, or inferring risk where data are thin. And most importantly, we should resist the temptation to turn one number into a full moral narrative, because that is where sustainability ratings can become dangerously seductive. A score feels clean, a number feels authoritative, a ranking feels decisive, but real sustainability is rarely neat. It is contested and deeply bound up with systems that cross borders, sectors, and institutions. That is why multilateral cooperation still matters so much. Sustainability is not something companies solve alone, governments solve alone, or investors solve alone. And no ratings provider, however sophisticated, can compress that full reality into a single context-free truth. So here's the takeaway I want to leave you with. A sustainability rating can be useful. It can help us to ask sharper questions. It can reveal blind spots. It can discipline empty corporate storytelling. It can expose patterns that otherwise stay hidden. But a rating should never be worshipped, nor should it be interpreted as such. It should be interrogated. It should be read with enough humility to recognize that different models illuminate different parts of reality. And perhaps the deeper lesson is this: if sustainability is truly about building systems that can endure, adapt, and cooperate under pressure, then our tools of evaluation must become mature as well. They must be rigorous without becoming simplistic, critical without becoming performative, and ethical without becoming careless. That is the challenge, and that is why conversation matters. I'm Dr. Shelley-Ann John, and this is Sustainably SAJe. See you next time.